My father was very dark complexioned. I'm Punjabi by heritage, and my mother was very fair skinned. My father faced, interestingly, hurdles in getting married. Growing up, I was constantly reminded that my skin color was wheatish. All South Asians are familiar with that term, and where we try to rank it in the color hierarchy. When they went for their honeymoon to Kashmir, my mother was constantly asked by folks there, why did you get married to this Kallu or this Madrasi? You were so beautiful and gory, you could have fetched a better man. So, the woman who was running the agency, I still remember that call so vividly. She said, I have these two young girls who are two infants who are 2 years old, less than two. But you're a Punjabi. You might not want them. They are darker skin colored. Within even the adoption industry, fairer orphans have a better chance of being adopted than darker skin.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of What's Brown Got to Do with It. So, I'm very excited to introduce my guest today. Her name is Reena Kukreja, and Reena is an associate professor in the Department of Global Development Studies with a cross appointment to Gender Studies Department and an affiliation with the Cultural Studies program at Queen's University in Canada. So Reena actually wears many hats, and as well as being an academic, she is also an award-winning documentary filmmaker and a feminist activist. Her research interest includes gender, colorism, caste, migration, masculinities, and bordering regimes. Emerges out of her activism and work with communities, filmmaking, and her own life experiences. So, today we are actually going to be talking about colorism in transnational spaces. So, hi, Reena, how are you?
Hi, Shadia. Thank you for having me on board for this very important podcast and the topic that you have slated for discussion today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion and also talking a bit more about how colorism especially impacts us as brown folks.
Absolutely. Now, we were just discussing this just before we hit record and about how long this should be. And I'm aware that this topic can go on for hours. I know I've certainly had conversations that have lasted a very long time, but we're going to try and summarize this as much as we possibly can. So I would like to start by let's just kind of delve into your own experiences. Like, where did your interest in this topic or experience come from?
Um, Thank you for bringing up this question about where does my interest lie. Of course, it stems from my own personal life and experiences, and I think that always carries forward in our own research. Growing up, I was constantly reminded that my skin color was wheatish. All South Asians are familiar with that term, and where we
Mm.
try to rank it in the color hierarchy. My father was very dark skinned. We are Punjabi heritage. My mom was fairer hued. She was fairly light skinned. And of course, the stories that I grew up, apart from my own experience, which I'll recount in a moment, but I want to come back to my parents as a starting point, is that when they went for their honeymoon to Kashmir, my mother was constantly asked by folks there, why did you get married to this Kallu or this
Oh my
Madrasi?
God.
You were so beautiful and gory, you could have fetched a better man. And she
Wow.
said it was very hard to deal with that, especially when you're newly married, trying to get to know the man who you're married to.
Mm.
It was an arranged marriage. They fell deeply in love with each other, thankfully. But the violence of colorism continued in their life. That was the honeymoon set the foundation and it continued throughout. So when my mom got pregnant with the first child, the worry was, oda beta kala bacha kala te nahi
Mm.
hoega, or we hope that the child is not dark. So
Mm.
it carries in the womb the kind of skin bias. And so obviously when the child was born, the first thing they did was look at the skin tone. I don't know whether you're familiar with this whole strategy of trying to look behind the ear, to see how the color would play out as the
Oh,
child
really? I've never
grows.
heard of that.
Yeah,
Oh.
that's something I also learned as a kind of a midwives folklore, where you look at the flap of the skin behind the ear and see how the skin tone plays out. And so it's interesting how these biases are so deeply rooted and how they play out in our intimate lives. And of course, when
Mm.
I was growing up, it was always this um, tone of thankfulness that came from all the relatives who would come and visit us and say, "Oh, thank God, she's not dark skinned like her father.
Oh,
Otherwise,
wow.
she would have had a much harder time finding a marriage, a match in marriage." So I think what I'm saying is not singularly unique to me, but it is
Yeah.
something that resonates with a lot of people. But if I can take one more minute to talk a bit more about where my interest in colorism or skin tone bias stems also extends further in my life. I fell in love with this amazingly wonderful man who is from Bihar and he's dark skinned. So again, it played out in my own intimate life saying, "Are, why did you get married to this? Again, another Kalu. Do you want your children to be like that too?" And and of course, the Punjabis were the one that had this violence of color bias play out in my marriage. Um, we didn't have a child of our own, but when we went to adopt a child, um, and by that time we were both Canadian citizens, and so we were termed as NRI or non resident Indians, we realized that we could only adopt a child who had been rejected 3 times in the local adoption market. So both Paritosh, that's my partner's name, and I wanted to be ethical and fair and not, go the wrong route. So one time I remember being told that there were two girl childs who were available to be adopted. And so the woman who was running the agency, I still remember that call so vividly. She said, "I have these two young girls who are two infants who are 2 years old, less than two. But you're a Punjabi. You might not want them. They are darker skin colored. Punjabis want fairer children." And so I was introduced to how, within even the adoption industry, fairer orphans have a better chance of being adopted than darker skin. Now, these two amazing young infants had been rejected umpteen times by prospective Indian families, primarily because they were dark skinned. And the contradiction is so weird, right? At one level, you want to have a child, yet you are then shopping for the right skin tone. It's like, these are the kind of check marks I have. So,
It's
yeah, so these
awful.
are, yeah, it is. So you can see how internalized the skin tone bias is and how it plays out within the intimate aspect of our lives in
Of
multiple
Yeah.
ways.
I mean, to hear that still happens in this day and age is just so, it makes me sad, but I also, when you were talking about the wheatish skin color, I remember having this conversation about these South Indian like matrimonial sites such as shadi.com or something. And I believe they still ask, what is your skin color? And one of the options is like wheatish and, dark or fair. And why does it even matter now? I mean, the world has progressed. Even when we look at South Indians, if we look at the media, because obviously it is the media that portrays so much of this, I feel like even in the world of modeling or glitz and glamour, there is so like darker skin models are highlighted so much more now than before. But then you still got things like Fair and Lovely. I think that name changed, I believe, but the concept of it actually didn't change. It's still, the advert still shows someone's, at the end of it being 10
Mhm.
shades lighter. Like how, and okay, in India, I can understand that happening. There's so much more education to still be had. But do you think that this still happens in, places like Canada or in the Western society?
Um, those are a number of questions that you asked me.
Sorry.
Just want to clarify. When you're talking about South Indians, I think you're referring to South Asians, because when
South
in
Asian,
India,
sorry, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
when we talk about South Indians in India, there's a kind of a
Yeah.
racial divide too, a kind of an
Yeah.
ethnocentrism that the Punjabis and the North Indians have, where
Yeah.
the South Indians are called Kalus and Madrasis, and they're all pejoratively dark skinned. So, yeah, to talk about the dating, the matrimonial arenas, I think that still continues. And the sad part is that we assume that as India globalized, or that as more and more people got educated and aware, that somehow these kinds of uh, prejudices and discriminations would somehow wither away with increased learning. Unfortunately, it hasn't occurred in India. And it carries forward in transnational spaces for two reasons. One is that, and here I'm going to just do a deep dive into my own academic work, but speak in a kind of an accessible language, is because within the caste ideology that is so deeply entrenched within India, darkness or darker skin tone is associated with lower caste. This is how it has been played out historically. And of course, one argues, people are quick to dismiss it and say, oh, the skin tone bias came only with the Goras or the Britishers, the British colonialists. But of course, what we see is that it predates the colonial encounter. It is very
Mm.
deeply rooted within the caste ideology, where darker skinned folks are equated with the lower castes or the Dalits,
Mm.
and people who do menial work. And
Mm.
historically, it was also associated with lower castes having lesser intelligence. So it equates to a lower worth in terms of economic prospects as well. So, caste ideology is very deeply entrenched in India even now.
Mm.
Um, and that doesn't go away. The other thing that's happened is that um, with the global transnational cosmetic industry, they have
Mm.
deliberately played up this whole scheme of fairness as capital, saying, fairness as a beauty ideal.
Mm.
They stand to gain immensely by that. Just to give you an example, within India, there was a survey that was done, and it said that over 90% of the women that were surveyed in the ages of 16 to 65, remember the range is pretty high, almost all of them, 90%, desired fairer skin.
Oh,
Now, that
wow.
in itself is a contradiction, because India is a tropical country and a
Yeah.
majority of its people are darker hued. Within the marriage market, it plays the dark skin bias, as you talked about, the shadi.com or whichever matrimonial site, whether it's online or whether it's in print. It also plays out by men demanding higher dowry, and also
Mm.
marrying a fairer skinned bride is seen as a higher worth, that this man's economic or social ability is such that he can garner a gori bahu or a gori
Wow.
wife. So
Wow.
it's equated immediately to a higher status. So if
Mm.
someone fell in love with a darker skinned woman, it would be it the question often is asked, why, what was wrong with you that you couldn't fetch a fairer woman?
Mm.
Right? An inverse of what my mother faced in the late 1950s, where she was asked a similar question: why couldn't you get married to a fairer man? You're so fair and beautiful. Why did you settle for someone who's lesser than? So
Mm.
dark skin is always lesser than. And then to come back to the question of darker hued models being now desired, for modeling. I think it's interesting. Darker skin folks have been hypersexualized too. They're seen as exotic.
Ah,
Um,
yeah.
and that ties well with the European colonial encounter, where you had the black and the brown female bodies seen
Mm,
as exotic, something to be consumed. If you look at ads, even of chocolates, you have a brown woman displaying a bar of chocolate.
mm,
So it's that kind of exotic fetishization. But of course, it's exotic to be consumed, but not to be taken in a long term relationship.
yeah. That's so interesting. I've never actually thought about the subliminal messaging when it comes to these things. And when we were talking about like the media, for example, then it reminded me that there's a song, and it says, the lyrics are गोरे रंग का जमाना कभी होगा ना पुराना गोरी डर तुझे किसका है तेरा तो रंग गोरा है. And so for those who can't understand Urdu or Hindi, what that translates to is the being fair will never go out of fashion. What are you worried about? You're white, basically. And so the fact that these songs are still kind of playing, and with this in all these like South Asian songs, or you listen to this still referencing to Gauri, it's insane. I mean, I'm not saying they'll turn around and say Kali in a song, but the fact that referencing to Gauri or white in a positive or in a way that it's being highlighted in songs, and kids are listening to this, it just kind of, again, subliminal messaging reinforcing that white is supremacy.
Mhm. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, that song, for those of you who don't know, thanks Shadia for bringing it up, is sung by Ali Haider. You can see it on YouTube as well. I just want to go on to talk a bit more about the song, particularly because it goes on later on to say, Gori gori baahon ka maza to kuch aur hai.
Mm,
The pleasure of fair-skinned arms is somehow better. And so what it is hearkening to is the kind of sexual desire, the sexual pleasure or desirability
mm,
of having access to fairer skin as a sexual partner is very interesting. And it's also reinforcing the attractiveness of fairness in a global world. And 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 it's always done oppositionally. We have to understand when they are reinforcing gore rang ka zamana hai, or this is the world belongs to fairer skinned women, or that the pleasure is far more intense to have fairer arms engulf you in an embrace. It's always
mm,
has the message that darker hued is lesser,
mm,
that the sexual pleasure or desirability would be much less if you had a woman with darker skin embrace you.
mm,
And of course, it goes on. The violence, the color based violence in that song is pretty intense. And I think, Shadia, you had brought it to my notice when we spoke informally. It says, Gore rang ka nazara lage sabko hi pyara. Everyone's happy to see a fairer skinned person, thus um, creating what we call a kind of a desirability and a non-desirability bias. And
yeah.
as you hear it, it filters through subconsciously. It's internalized, it's reinforced, and it creates what we call a beauty cue, in which a fairer skinned female is at the top of that hue, whereas the darker skinned female is at the bottom
Mm,
of that hue. And imagine the violence for someone who's darker hued, who is constantly reminded within the intimacy of their homes. And South Asians are particularly good in telling their children who is darker, put some
Nick.
malai or put some doodh on your
Oh,
skin.
yeah. Or
Um,
actually giving them nicknames, right? Like, kallu or something. And we spoke about this before as well, but I find that generation, like, for example, my parents' generation, their sense of humor was always at the expense of someone else. And these microaggressions by, golu, kalu, motu, these kind of things, it was just normal. But the effects of that, or the self-fulfilling prophecy that comes out of those things, is just enormous. Like, why do we call someone kallu? Like, why?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I have seen that myself, right? With my father being called Kalu
Oh wow,
continuously by
yeah.
his brothers and sisters, by his siblings. So, and you rightly point out these are microaggressions that are positioned as loving,
Mm,
loving nicknames. However, they are
mm,
not loving nicknames. They carry immense violence for someone who's at the receiving end of it, right?
mm.
Whether you're fat shaming someone or you're color shaming someone. And again, we often try and brush it off by saying, oh, we meant it jokingly or we meant it lovingly.
Yeah,
It's like racism, right?
yeah,
That is experienced by brown and black skin in white spaces. Oh, we didn't mean to do it, but it just
yeah.
happened. But it talks about how deep rooted these kind of biases are, or dark skin discrimination,
Mm,
that even for our own child we don't even think a moment to reproduce it
mm.
in the daily activity of loving and caring. And I just want to bring it to your attention that it has a tremendous negative outcome for the child as they grow up. It's a psychological stress, but it also results in low self-esteem, in terms
Mm.
of low self-worth, that somehow I'm lesser than. Parents, of course, remind especially girls that as you grow up we'll have to pay for a bigger dowry, or you'll have a
Mm.
harder time finding marriage partners. It's not as if you need to grow up and become independent. Even now I hear within my friends' families, and these are what we call privileged Indian families back home, that they're constantly saying, oh, we have to start putting away more money for her because she's darker skinned. So
Oh
somehow
wow.
it's taken for granted that
Mm.
men, that one, that we will give dowry, second,
Yeah.
that yes, that it's totally okay and legit for men to demand bigger dowry to marry darker skinned women. So it appears as if you're at one level you're taking more dowry, and then on the other hand you're doing this darker skinned woman a deep favor by marrying her. So, yeah, so this is how it's kind of enacted within the intimacy of the family as the girl grows out. And of course, it plays out in transnational spaces too.
Yeah.
My own daughter is dark skinned, and people come and say, oh, she's darker skinned, but she's growing to be beautiful, as if,
Oh wow. But but she's
yes,
growing to be beautiful.
yes. So, yeah, saying
I also
thank God.
Yeah, I also wonder, like, I mean, there's the South Asian, the national spaces, as we spoke about, but also I find that, I mean, I live in a place where there are a lot of the South Asian diaspora live here, and so we have people from all over, and a lot of the times the laborers, they are South Asian. So my own experiences have really been that when somebody that is a non-South Asian meets me, they need to box me, or I need to tick a box where they need to find out, like, what is my likability for them. And so it becomes like, okay, they don't want to, they say I'm South Asian. When you think of South Asian here, I think people always immediately think of laborers or taxi drivers and that kind of level of workers. But then they're like, okay, you don't look like one of them, so now I need to like you. Now, I don't consider myself to be fair, I consider myself to be quite normal, wheatish, as you would say, or maybe slightly darker, medium. You know, if I'm buying makeup, I go for medium. And so they look at you like, okay, so you're not fair even. So how can I like you? And I remember once this person said to me, where are you from? And then they automatically assume Indian. So they're like, Indian, and you learn to not argue. And I said, yeah, I'm Indian. And he's like, oh, okay, but you look like a rich Indian. And I was just taken aback, like, what does a rich Indian look like? And okay, so your box is money. Okay, I've ticked that. So please go ahead and kind of help me with what I'm here for. Or, you know, I've heard people say to me, I've had people come up to me and say, are you Bollywood? I don't know what that means to this day, but, you know, are you Bollywood? So, okay, your idea of successful or likability in terms of South Asian is someone that's in Bollywood. I also had one person say to me once, how are you Indians so rich? How do you get so rich? Selling spices. And
Hmm.
it's like, what do you say? Now, if I wonder if I was fairer, I mean, I have friends who are much, much fairer, and nobody would ever question them. Nobody would ask them, where are you from? Because they would automatically assume that they are maybe of Arab descent or something. Um, and so the discrimination between my fairer skin friends and myself, I actually never noticed it as much as I have done since moving to this side of the world.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very complex and interesting what you're talking about, how colorism or skin tone, skin color stratification plays out in transnational spaces. And of course, what you're pointing out also is to the politics of location, the politics of migration, and the kind of
Mm,
employment that is offered to brown and black people in transnational
mm,
spaces.
absolutely.
So yeah, so perhaps I'll come back to your questions because these are really profound questions that you're asking. But I'll come back and I'll begin by talking about Canada,
Mm,
because the skin color stratification, or what we call skin color hierarchy, plays
mm,
out in the national arena too, in our everyday behavior and
mm,
encounters. And of course, at the overt level, all of us are familiar with racism, right?
mm,
Racism, of course, works on one level, but within racism, there's another level of discrimination, which is colorism,
yeah,
associating someone with a particular skin tone as belonging to a certain class or a
yeah.
community of workers. Because this is how um, certain groups of societies have been able to build their economies, by using transnational migrants who are quite often from the global south. So, in our instance, it plays out in the role of a nanny.
Mm,
A darker skin tone, if I'm dressed differently, if I'm dressed to the nines, quote unquote, then obviously the class privilege overrides to some
yeah.
extent. But if I'm just dressed in my tights and sweats, then I'm assumed to be a nanny, because this is how white folks associate. And these are what we call
Yeah.
stereotypes. It's
Yeah.
stereotypes based on their understanding, how they have had this kind of a knowledge filter. Um, and and of course, when you say when people say to you, did you become rich selling spices, of course it talks about a certain trope of the South Asian other, who only either cooks curry, quote unquote,
Yeah.
a generic term, or
Yeah.
or becomes rich by just like pataks,
Yeah.
selling curry. And
Yeah.
that, of course, in some level shows their ignorance, but also shows how subliminal all of these discriminations are, and how they transcend class, they transcend spaces, and how they shape how we can interact with people, or even say hello and have a quick
Mm,
coffee, shape our relationships in the office or in normal spaces.
yeah.
Um, And of course, with all of that comes certain kind of biases about how we behave culturally. uh,
Hmm.
you know uh, Assuming that because you're darker skinned and you're South Asian, that somehow you're going to be very conservative in your daughter's upbringing. So I've had
Yeah.
white mums of my daughter's friends say to me that we didn't invite your daughter to go out because we felt in your culture you don't allow. So no,
Oh,
it's
wow.
those kind of assumptions. So
Yeah.
yeah, coming back to your own experience in the so-called Middle East per se, yes, of course, we have a huge population of South Asians, whether we are looking at Indian origin, Pakistani, Sri Lankan, or Nepali, working
Hmm.
at all levels. But of course, at the lower level, the most. And of course, it feeds into this whole notion that the working class, anyone who's not fair, is a worker
Hmm.
who works for me, a worker who is economically lesser, is of lesser worth, and therefore also equal to lesser educational attainments, because the majority of the workers who come here um, are not coming here as professionals. They're coming here as in a different kind of a worker category. They don't have higher educational attainments and therefore don't have a lot of social or economic mobility to attain. So for people to encounter you in a different space, clothed in a certain way, speaking in a certain language, of course destabilizes their way of understanding you, of trying to decode you. Somehow they are not able to fit you into their way of thinking that they have assumed to be the norm. And
You
thus
know,
these.
Rena, it reminds me, like, there's we all laugh about it, I laugh about it with my friends, but there's a very typical question that you get asked here. And that is, where are you from? But then it's, where are you really from? So, for me, when somebody asks me, where are you from? I'm from England. I'm from London. I was born and raised.
Mhm. You're absolutely right. The question about where are you from has a subtext of where are you really from.
Mm,
You spoke about your experience of being questioned about your inclusion as a British um, citizen. For me, the question arises about me being questioned about my Canadianness. So when
mm,
I travel a lot for my research. And of course, I have a Canadian passport. So when people meet me in the street or when they meet me in research spaces, the question always comes up, where are you from? And I say, I'm from Canada. No, 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 no. It always begins with a no, 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 no.
yeah,
But tell us, where are you really from?
really
And
from.
yeah, and so I start laughing and I say, okay, make a guess. Oh, you must be Indian. So there's this
Yeah.
kind of an equation, and I ask, why do you assume that I cannot be Canadian? And that is where the question comes up: is equating race with nation, equating race and nation and our own unbelongingness to a nation because of our own skin tone. And of course, any
Hmm.
kind of a national identity is highly linked to a racialized identity as well, particularly in the global north, especially where you have Canada or Britain or the US seen as white spaces, and where we as brown or black bodies are seen as interlopers, as not belonging. So in that sense, the question that always is asked, even for someone who's a seventh generation
Hmm.
immigrant to Canada, is where are you really from? Whereas someone who can just come and land from France into Canada, they would be absorbed or integrated within the community because whiteness is seen as belonging to a nation. And
Yeah.
it's
Right.
interesting how it carries across transnational spaces and gets worked out, say, in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, or say, even a place like Kenya or Indonesia or Thailand or Greece, right? So, and it's also brings up this very disturbing question for both you and me and others like us, who have a different national identity, have grown up or have taken on a different national identity of where do we then belong if
Yeah.
the world doesn't recognize us as either British or Canadian, and on the
Yeah.
other hand, Indians or whoever are rejecting us and saying, you are not.
Yeah.
Somehow we assume you are not really Indian because you are now a a transnational citizen. Salman Rushdie, I think I'm not going to paraphrase. I'm going to paraphrase him. He said, "People like us are really the bastard children. We we really have we really cannot claim any deep roots." And that
Absolutely.
is a real tragedy for brown and black folks, because that then brings up the question of national identity, citizenship, and inclusion and exclusion. And
Hmm.
for me and my partner, when we were adopting or consciously choosing to adopt, this was a question that we both discussed for a long while before throwing in our towel for adoption, because we said we have been exposed to racism, micro and macro aggressions of racism on a daily basis. Um, we we didn't want our child to be exposed to that as well. To talk about this whole question of national identity, belonging and unbelonging, and how it is so closely tied to our skin
Hmm.
tone. When my partner and I were thinking of adopting, we 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 had long discussions about whether we wanted to expose our adopted child to the violence of
Hmm.
racism, color tone discrimination. But of course, we jumped in and went ahead with that. And of course, now it's playing out in her own life as well. Um, I wanted to bring up this very interesting thing. I was traveling with my colleagues for work, and I was in Italy, and I was traveling with my partner and my daughter, and my colleagues said to me, "You could pass off as someone Italian easily."
Oh, wow.
um, and so it would be easy for you to travel here, unlike your partner. And then they looked at my husband and they looked at my daughter, and there was a pregnant pause. You can imagine how difficult it is to live with these hierarchies on a daily basis, but
Hmm.
also see them being being reproduced so normally by your friends, your family members, your relatives in transnational spaces, and even your research colleagues.
Wow. That's, I mean, to think that, people are so blunt and to be able to just be so comfortable to say these things. I don't know what's more shocking, the things that they are saying or the fact that they're comfortable enough to say that. And to, I can't imagine the what your little girl goes through hearing this and questioning like, but why am I different? And kids, they're so influenced, and as they get older, like how that actually really does play and work out in their lives, and the insecurities that they develop. We I just want to go back and touch upon like your father and what you said, and I can only imagine what your mother was going through, because men, my own experience and opinion is that sometimes they need that little bit more of an ego, like the massage, and they need to feel that secure, and especially in that generation where the man had to feel kind of manly. So to hear that and feel that he was made to feel lower than your mother, and the fact that all these years later, like, these conversations are still taking place, it's just bizarre to me.
Mhm. And you're absolutely right. The bizarreness of the whole skin tone discrimination or colorism cannot be underscored more than
Hmm.
enough. I think you're absolutely right in talking about the impact on the man, particularly because it brings up the whole discussion on masculinity, which I work on. It creates a kind of a lesser than masculine worth. And
Mm.
thankfully, my parents didn't have an abusive relationship, but I've seen in relationships elsewhere, particularly in the research that I've done in rural India, that it works out as kind of uh, aggression towards the partner.
Mm.
When you have a kind of having to deal with this kind of failed masculine worth or lesser masculine worth, you're trying to make up in a different way.
Yeah.
And you're taking out your anger against your partner, who you see as the culprit for your woes, your masculine woes. On the other hand, when darker skinned women marry fairer skinned men, but with a higher dowry, they're always reminded of the charity and magnanimity of the man and his family to marry her. That is
Yeah.
never let aside. The woman is constantly reminded, we did you a favor
Yeah. Oh
by
gosh.
marrying
Yeah.
you. So it's
Yeah.
interesting. But why isn't it going away is the bigger question. And I want to circle back to this whole discussion about why it isn't going away is because the cosmetic industries are constantly peddling this whole notion of fairness as beauty. They are marketing it aggressively, and they're doing it because they garner huge profits. They're using our own
Mm.
biases but are peddling it continuously.
Profiting from
You
it. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
you can see it in India or South Asia, where they're using um, Indian film stars, famous film stars, to peddle this whole fair and lovely, or
They're
whatever you
lovely.
call, yeah, or any other fairness, or what we call skin whitening creams,
Yeah.
lotions, gels, so on and so forth. But also using these ads with a before and after narrative. If you were darker
Mm.
skinned, you would not get a job. If you're darker skinned,
Yeah.
you're rejected in the marriage market. But if you have a fairer skin, voila, your life transforms instantly.
Yeah.
So much so that if I'm not mistaken, one of these skin whitening cosmetic company started marketing these skin whitening vaginal douches
Oh
with the
wow.
ad, yeah, talking about I forget now what it's called, but the ad in itself was highly problematic. It showed this man who's ignoring his partner, and she's kind of tense and worried. And then, of course, the voiceover comes, use this. And so she starts using this vaginal douche to lighten her pubic area. And then you see both the partner and she in a very happy embrace. So, again,
Oh
talking
wow.
of our highest sexual satisfaction is derived from having sex with.
I mean, in a way, it's progressive because we can openly have these ads about sex and these things, but on
Yeah,
the
it
other
might
hand,
be
it's so
progressive.
regressive. It's so
Uh,
regressive. So, Rena, I think this is a conversation that we can have for hours on end, and it's so much deeper than we've just touched the surface level. And I really hope actually you'll come back and maybe we could talk about some of the other things that are to do with colorism. So many of the sub subjects that come out. But before you go, what I would really love to ask you is obviously, what's brown got to do with it? But what does being brown mean to you?
Yeah, we could have this conversation for many hours. And I guess many of the people who'd be listening to the podcast would also want to engage in these kind of conversations. So, what does brown being mean to me? It's a very profound question, and one that I find hard to answer. At one level, I think one has to ask, what does brown mean to me being in Canada? Mean to
Mm,
me when I travel overseas to spaces that are
mm,
not South Asian, because that's where my brownness comes into question. I can never being brown in a space like Canada, or you could say any transnational space, means I'm constantly aware of my skin, of
Mm.
my otherness. It's something that lives with me. It's a disprivilege that comes with my skin tone. However wheatish I might be within the South Asian community, within the larger transnational community where whiteness is aspired for, is valorized, is seen as higher in ranking,
Mm.
um, my brownness is I always have to work against my brownness to show that I am better in educational attainments, in my research abilities, in my activism. So it's brownness for me in my daily encounters also is equated as a lesser intelligence. That's how sometimes people read. And and so I have to constantly struggle. I equate my brownness with struggle and with an identity marker that will never go away, that sees me as inferior.
Wow. Wow. That's I think that just opens up so many more questions for me. And so maybe I'll save that for the next episode or another episode. I really hope you do come back. I think there's a lot to unpack there because so much of that, what you just said, resonates with me. But thank you, Reena. Thank you so much for joining today and having this really, really much needed and intense conversation. And I think we don't talk about this enough. And, you know, thank you for all the wonderful research and the work that you are doing and bringing these topics to light. I know that you came to Abu Dhabi, you've done a conference here, and I know that people who attended that conference were just blown away by some of the things that you were talking about. So I do hope we can have you back on the show. In the meantime, wishing you all the best with all the work that you're doing. And thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Shadia, for having me on this show. And I really appreciate your kind words about my own research and the kind of work that I do around colorism. And of course, it's a topic that we can go on discussing, as I mentioned, for hours on end. And of course, it's lived on our intimate lives on a daily basis. So it's something that we cannot ignore. And I'm glad you're bringing up this whole question about brownness as an identity. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you again. And in the meantime, thank you.
Thank you, Rena. Thank you.